They're people who are ignorant. They don't think that I'm a real Jew or that I'm Jewish enough or that I'm doing the right thing. They viewed me as less of because my Judaism wasn't at that same level as theirs. Hello, I'm Zane Braslawsce, a mixed martial artist and Orthodox Jew. I grew up in a small town outside of Pittsburgh. It's called Beaver, Pennsylvania, population about 5,000. I was the only Jewish kid there, and we grew up going to a Reform synagogue, which is about a 30-minute drive away. I grew up in a very traditional home, but Reform. So we had this weird sense of Jewish pride and identity, but didn't know what it meant at all. Didn't have anything outside of like Hanukkah and maybe a Shabbat meal, or maybe going to services on a Friday night and Saturday morning. Growing up, I didn't even know that Jews prayed more than twice a week. I thought Friday night and Saturday were the only times they went to shul. And so this weird identity of also having immigrant grandparents from Czechoslovakia and Moldova, that they had a very strong sense of Jewish pride. They always had Pesach Seders. They always told you to marry Jewish. They always had these ideals and values that they showed, but it didn't come out in a religious way.
How did you find that confusion, between what you heard and the messages you saw from your grandparents and then what was actually practiced at home? How did that make you feel?
I guess growing up, I didn't understand. I didn't know what there was and what there wasn't in Judaism. There was such a lack of education growing up that what I understood to be Yiddishkeit, I felt I was doing all the way. And it wasn't until later that I learned more about Judaism and the Torah and the more explicit laws and the different traditions and things that are more considered more Orthodox, that I realized that there was so much that was missing as a younger child. But I didn't at the time, I had no idea that the values that I was holding and my practices were contradicting.
Were you ever curious about your Judaism as a kid?
Yeah, I was always extremely curious. It was something that I always wanted to learn more about. Physical mitzvahs were things that most drew me in, having like a mezuzah or having like a Star of David necklace or things like that, physical things that I could interact with, having kiddush, having the Havdalah spices was like something that I could feel and sense and taste and hear and touch. Those physical things that is infused with Judaism were things that I was really, really drawn towards.
Why do you think that's the case?
So I think I've always been a physical learner. I'm a mixed martial artist as well. I used to have a gym in Crown Heights and I taught self-defense. I grew up wrestling and wrestled in college and did all these. I was always athletic and always doing sports stuff. And so one of the ways I learned things the most was being able to do things with my body. And whenever I could feel something or taste something or touch something, it made a deeper impact on my psyche.
Let's talk about you being into martial arts. How did you get into that?
Me getting into martial arts stems a lot from my childhood. And this is trauma alert. Growing up, I divorced parents, and I always felt like unsafe. I always felt unsafe in my house growing up because of the relationship I had with my father and different things like that, which eventually when I was 16 years old became violent and physically violent, and I had to live with my mom full time. And so growing up, I'm a small person in general, and I always felt the need to protect myself and to be able to give myself the sense that I can control a situation or I'm strong, and that I can fight back and that people won't mess with me because they're afraid of me. And so this is sort of what got me into martial arts to begin with. And I started doing karate at a very young age, and then got into wrestling and wrestled into college. And then when I was in college, I did rugby and all these other aggressive sports, and eventually landed on mixed martial arts, which combined my wrestling and my karate and all these other things, and like boxing and all these things I wanted to do as a kid. And the draw to it was not necessarily for the right reasons, but after joining it, the right reasons came out.
With the anger and frustration you experienced in your childhood, as you mentioned, what made you choose a path eventually that seemingly added like another layer of expectation that can bear more frustration in life?
So as a child, at some point, I don't know when, but I started having problems with authority and having issues with being complacent in following other people's rules and expectations of me. And so I was quite a rebellious kid, always trying to do things that were out of the box or the unexpected things that were out of the social norms, trying to create a reaction out of people that they wouldn't otherwise expect. And that would display itself in me acting out. I bit a kid when I was in 3rd grade and always had these anger issues and had to go to anger management and different things as a child to help ease me.
Did you feel like something was missing in your life that Judaism added to, or was that just a natural curiosity that sort of came out of nowhere?
I think it's a natural curiosity, but I knew earlier the value that Judaism played in the role it played in my life, that it was a huge part of my identity, and that it was something that no matter what was steadfast, unchanging. No matter who I was or what I did or where I went, it would always boil down to however I identify myself, I will always be a Jew. Like, it's not anything I can do to change it. That's just what it is. And so that's like this wanting to strengthen that identity means knowing more about it. So knowing more about Judaism means knowing more about myself, knowing more about who I am, what makes me up, what's my history, what's my culture, what are values that my ancestors have had, what helped bring me and my people to the place that we are right now.
When was the first time you realized you wanted to come closer to Judaism? How old were you, and where do you think that pull came from?
I think it started when I joined a group called Diller Teen Fellows, which is a pluralistic leadership Jewish group that was in the city in Pittsburgh, which I live about an hour away. So when I grew up with no Jewish friends and no Jews in my hometown, I was the only Jew. And so when I joined this group, I ended up getting a connection with other Jews, having other Jews my age, becoming friends and creating a community, something that I never really had before, a strong community and friends and other people that were having similar experiences as me. And so when I was in this group, we traveled to Israel, and while we were there, there's Orthodox students that are in this group as well. And when I was there, I got exposed to way more different things in Yiddishkeit. So I became aware of what else there was out there, and that, I think, sparked this huge journey that I kind of threw myself into. My journey started in terms of curiosity when I was about 16, and I grew up Reform, and at that point I got exposed to more conservative, what is labeled conservative Judaism, and then I became way more involved in conservative Judaism. I decided on my own that I wasn't going to go to the synagogue that my family went to anymore. I was going to go to a conservative synagogue and drive an hour into the city as opposed to the half-hour drive to go to this more traditional, more religious shul. And when I turned 18 and went to college, it sort of continued along that path. In actuality, when I was on my campus, I avoided the campus shliach. I avoided Mendy for as long as I possibly could, because in my mind they're people who are ignorant. They don't think that I'm a real Jew or that I'm Jewish enough or that I'm doing the right thing. That they viewed me as less of because my Judaism wasn't at that same level as theirs. So I avoided this rabbi for a long time, and eventually he was tabling at the only exit to one of my buildings from class, and so I had no choice but to walk by him. And I mamish walked by with my hand up next to my face so he wouldn't see me. But he called me out by name, because if you know any campus shliach, they know every Jew on campus by name. And so he called me over, and I'm a nice guy, so I didn't say no. And I walked over to him, and we started chatting, and I asked him as many questions as I could try to ask him that I thought would make him out to be the monster that I had made him in my mind. So I was asking him about all the anything I could think of that was controversial or that I thought he might have like a bigoted answer to. And every time he gave me an answer, it was I agreed with him, and it made it like harder. So I was almost angry at him that like he was giving me these answers that I was like, wow, that makes sense. And I think that also. And wow, I was really blown away by how wrong and ignorant I was about him. And so that made me even more curious. And then he asked me if I wanted to learn that week's Parsha, and it was infused with Chassidus. And that was something that I was looking for in my life at the time.
Where do you think that perception that people who dress in black and white and have a very Orthodox look, because it's quite a universal perception, unfortunately, where do you think that came from? That feeling disconnected from them and that, they're the monster?
I think it's lack of exposure and education. I grew up, like I said, I was the only Jew in my town. The only time I heard about an Orthodox Jew or more religious Jews was at my Reform synagogue, where these more religious Jews were not seen in a good light. And the relationship between Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews is not, like those movements is not necessarily the best either. So more often than not, people tend to take a defensive stance and say, I must be right and everybody else must be wrong. And I think that was kind of cemented into me because of that, because I felt attacked for no reason. I had no justification. It was just from lack of exposure, not having any actual Orthodox Jew to talk to growing up, or to be friends with, or to go to a Shabbat meal and to see who they were. They weren't real people to me. It was just an image that I never actually got to know.
You mentioned that your curiosity about Judaism came from a wanting to understand your identity and purpose. Was there any point in your life or specific episode or experience that you felt really challenged you to ask yourself that question, who am I and where do I come from?
Yeah, every day. I mean, not every day, thank God, not such a big identity crisis or of sorts, but there's been multiple occasions where my values and my actions weren't aligned. And this inner conflict created this identity crisis. Because of the things that I enjoyed and wanted to do physically, but also the things that I valued emotionally and spiritually. On the surface, and what I thought, and when I thought of myself in the future, they weren't things that I wanted, but in the moment, they were things that I wanted. They were things I desired in the moment, but if I thought about it in the long run, they weren't things that I desired. In the long run, I wanted a wife, a kids, Shabbat meals at my house, kosher, a library of books as soon as you walk into the house, pushkas and like little kids running around with tzitzis and kippahs and dresses and all that. And my actions at the time were to fulfill these short-term desires that I had. So any girlfriends that I had at the time and any non-kosher food I was eating, they were all to satisfy this surface level desire that I had. But they went totally against these long-term values and things that I wanted in my life.
How did your family react to you making this big transition in your life?
So it wasn't all at once that they accepted it. It was very difficult, especially in the beginning, and especially for myself when I wasn't sure where I was standing in my Judaism. For my parents to be able to handle and work with me, and as I was navigating that space was difficult. So my mother, who I didn't know had an Orthodox conversion, which means that she knew all of these laws that I was just now learning about. So when I came home from yeshiva, my mom was like, oh, let me know what lights I need to leave on. Let me know like about this and that. And I was like, how do you know? Like, I just learned about this a week ago and I'm trying to do it. And you're like already are preparing everything in the house for me. So I was very blessed in that sense. But in the same light, at the end of my freshman year of college, my mashpia at Case Western, he wanted me to go to yeshiva. And I was like, that's not for me. There's no way, I can't do it. I don't think, like, even though I was into Yiddishkeit, it just seems so antithetical to the journey that I was on, because I felt there was no future in Judaism. Like, I couldn't be a religious Jew. Like, there's not a future for me in religious Judaism. I have to get an internship this summer. I have to like do a work study. I have to do this thing that's going to help me in my career and my family later on, because that's what society tells me that I have to do in order to be successful, in order to be a better person, or to give back, to be deemed a meaningful life in society's eyes. I had to conform to these things. So it ended up being Hashgacha Pratis, like divine intervention, that summer there was a yeshiva program called Mayanot, and they had a co-program with internships in Israel. So I ended up being able to do yeshiva full-time for a couple of months and over the summer, and then yeshiva part-time with an internship over the summer. So I agreed to go because of this, but it ended up being that I didn't like my internship so much, and I just loved yeshiva, and I spent most of my time skipping the internship and just learning all day. And so when I went there, my mother was terrified that I would go all the way in and never come back. She thought I was going to move to Israel and never come back to her and never finish college and do all of these things. So while my mom was super supportive of my Jewish journey, she was terrified that I would go off the deep end, so to say, and jump right into this life that I knew nothing about, that I'm just learning of. And I think that's in most cases, for most people that are becoming more religious, a lot of the time their parents are afraid just because they don't know, they're not exposed. They felt the same way I did before I met Mendy, that all Jews are ignorant and they hate everybody else and they're seclusive and they don't let anybody else in their lives, and like, I'm not going to talk to my parents anymore, I can't eat at their house, and all these different things that they are afraid of because they want what's best for you.
When people speak about their transformational journeys towards a more observant life, sometimes they mention that it comes with a bit of guilt and shame. So how did you navigate that?
So it's funny, like the tattoos for me, there was never anything I felt guilty or ashamed about. Other things like having girlfriends or eating non-kosher food, I always felt like guilty about, or breaking Shabbos, it always like would eat away at me. Funny enough, like some things do and some things don't. Don't know why. Maybe because I've justified them so much before. But I think no matter what, whether you have tattoos, whether you're doing breaking Shabbos, whether you're doing any other avera or sin of sorts, there's going to be some sort of guilt. Even I know people that don't sin, that they get some sort of feeling of guilt from. Like people can feel guilty about something that isn't even bad or hurting somebody else or even hurting themselves. And the idea is that you have to remember that the guilt is useful, but only to a certain degree. So guilt is useful if it inspires action for things to be different for yourself. If guilt doesn't inspire action, but rather brings on depression and brings on self-hate and the self-loathing and disappointment that isn't encouraging, but rather makes you feel worse about yourself and makes you feel like you're less. That's coming from yourself, and it's also coming from the Yetzer Hara, this animal, this evil inclination, this self-doubt that it's no longer helpful, it's no longer useful.
You mentioned that as a child, you connected most to the physical rituals of Judaism. There's obviously a lot of spirituality that's a part of Judaism as well. So how did you come to appreciate, assuming that you do, the spiritual element of Judaism as well?
So it's something that I haven't come to terms with yet. It's something that I'm continuously growing. That's probably one of the things I struggle with most in my Jewish journey, is my connection with God, my connection with this greater being that is esoteric, and there's no tangibility to it. It's how do you cultivate something from nothing? It's insane. At the time that I was 18 and going into college, I was looking for more deeper meaning in my life, things that I wasn't finding in my Judaism. I read Siddhartha and I was reading up on Buddhism and all these other esoteric things. So I was becoming more intrigued and curious about an esoteric relationship of sorts, but I was finding that lacking in the Judaism that I was in at the time. And it wasn't until I started to learn Chabad Hasidus that I found this deeper meaning that I was looking for within my Judaism, within this thing that was such an integral part of my identity. Chabad stands for, it's an acronym, it means Chachma Bina Das, wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. And the idea of Chabad Hasidus is that if you can change your mindset about something, then it'll influence the rest of your speech and your actions, and eventually also your mindset whenever you first approach something.
Being somebody that didn't have a good relationship with authority, how did you navigate adopting a more observant lifestyle that generally comes with submission to a greater authority?
I think my issue growing up was inconsistent expectations. And not only that, but it being an external expectation that I had no control whether it changed one way or another. So society's expectations can always change of you. Your parents' expectations of you change as you grow older. The only system where the expectations are consistent, always the same, you know exactly what they're going to be at all times, is Judaism. There's no, they're not changing laws nowadays out of nowhere. So these values that are inherent in Judaism, they stay the values of Judaism. My own personal values can change as I grow, but having, I think, and also because it was my acceptance of it also, it wasn't necessarily that it happened all at once either, that like, oh, I'm taking all these on. It was slowly that, okay, I have to agree with that. I want these values. I value these same things. And so if I value these same things, I'm going to have to conform to the expectations of those values. In Fiddler on the Roof, it starts by going, we're religious Jews. Tevye is talking, he says, we're religious Jews, and every person knows who he is and what God expects him to do. And it's very freeing to have that. This God's expectations of me, it doesn't change. Hashem doesn't change. He is everything, everywhere, all at once.
Are there any things you currently find frustrating about Judaism?
Yeah, I'm sure I do. It's like with any family that you're a part of, there's things that are struggles, are hard. I think Avos Yisrael is probably one of the things I struggle with most. Love of a fellow Jew. Love of your fellow man in general is very, very difficult. And it's like when you have a brother or a sister who annoys you to no end, and you know that if you weren't this person's brother, you wouldn't be friends with them at all, but you have to be anyway because of your family. And so that, I think, is probably one of the hardest things, at least for me, in Judaism, is the idea of loving another Jew, loving myself.
Is there anything you miss about your past lifestyle?
Yeah, for sure. I think the freedom of it, in a sense, is something I miss. Like just being able to go out on a Saturday and hang out with friends or text somebody or go see a show. I can't do that anymore. I can't go get a cheeseburger. I can't when I'm doing a cross country trip, I can't stop at any fast food chain. I have to prepare all the food I have beforehand. I have to make sure I'm traveling on the right day at the right time. I have to make sure I'm stopping and praying and making a minyan. My life has become so much more involved, but it just means it's more intentional. At least that's how I view it, is my life has become more intentional. And so all these freedoms that I had before are no longer there, but it's something that I don't want because I want my life to be intentional. But I really, really miss cheeseburgers. Tattoos I don't miss. By the time I was getting done, as I was finishing up, I'm almost all the way covered. My entire back, my whole leg here is covered. Both my ribs, I'm all over. The only thing that's clean is like my face. And so, but by the time I was getting my last tattoo, I was sort of done with it. It wasn't, didn't hold the same pleasure that it had given me before whenever I was first getting tattoos. And probably it stems from the reason why I was getting tattoos in the first place was because who I was didn't align with who I wanted to be viewed as. Like I wanted to be seen as some tough, badass guy that nobody wanted to mess with. And so like getting tattoos makes me seem cooler and a little bit tougher. So if I can withstand that pain and I have like stuff on my body that like I don't care about what other people think, then that would be who I would be viewed as, and that would maybe be who I would become. Thank God it is eventually I started becoming not necessarily that person, thank God, but I started becoming who I actually wanted to be. And whenever I was being who I wanted to be and my value and my actions were aligned with those values, my desire to get tattoos and to be involved in these other short-term satisfaction, like to satisfy these mundane desires, it sort of went away.
Do you ever feel like your tattoos prevent you from integrating into the community?
I don't think they do. For me, I feel the opposite because I still have that little bit of rebelliousness in me, and I enjoy getting a little bit of a reaction out of people. And it brings me joy to see people so surprised to see somebody tattooed doing like really Hasidic, like religious things. That just seems very out of place, and that I think inspires me to integrate myself even more and make other people uncomfortable by occupying that space that is rightfully mine as a Jew.
You mentioned that you got a kick out of the punching and the aggression and that sort of anger, that ability to express anger. How do you reconcile that violence and Judaism, because they don't always seem like so aligned?
It's always something I am surprised about. Even now I can't seem to wrap my head around so much as I'll meet people, and because I've taught self-defense in these Orthodox communities, and I'm curious. I want to know, like, have you ever been in a situation where you felt like you needed to defend yourself? And I've come across certain Jews that they feel like it's better to get punched in the face and let it happen to them than to fight back. And so I don't think that is necessarily a Jewish value, though. I think that might be an extreme stance. And I think to say that Judaism doesn't condone violence is not necessarily totally correct. I mean, a lot of the Torah has violent things happening, but the idea for me that was the way I was able to make it work. And I remember having like many conversations with God about this and trying to figure out like how do I get to do this thing that I love, that I know goes against like what I should be doing. Like I shouldn't be prize fighting. I shouldn't be going and punching people in the face as like a job. It doesn't make sense. It's not, that sort of thing is not necessarily a Jewish value, but the other things that come with mixed martial arts is so intrinsically intertwined with Judaism that it's impossible for me to separate the two. So for example, being at peace and being mindful of all of your actions is inherent to both mixed martial arts and Judaism. They're totally inseparable. And so whenever you're able to take the output of mixed martial arts, of something violent, and you're able to give it the guidance or the reins that Judaism has, these values that give you guidance, you're able to channel that energy and that power for something that's really, really good. So instead of fighting, now I'm doing self-defense, which essentially it's the same thing, but the intention behind it and the results of it are totally, totally different. If I'm trying to learn martial arts to become a more violent, aggressive, and like strong person, then I may end up getting into a street fight and things like that. But real martial artists and people who are really committed to Judaism and understanding Jewish values, they'll realize that they want the ability to be able to hurt somebody else. And even more so, they want the ability to refrain themselves from hurting anybody else.
Why did you decide to open up a self-defense gym in the Jewish community?
It started with, first, my desire for martial arts. In general, I had a capacity and a passion for it. But more so, my life was directly affected by a lot of anti-Semitic and attacks that happened in America over the past few years. And for example, the one that hit really close to home was the shooting in Pittsburgh, where it happened at a synagogue, actually, where my cousin is the rabbi there. So, and I've heard all sorts of other things about that story on the back end, that it was actually a big miracle that more people didn't die. Not only is my cousin the rabbi there, but I've been to that synagogue before. I've done retreats with like Jewish teen retreats at this synagogue. It's someplace that's close to home and feels like home, and that it was violated so horribly that it felt that for me to have the skills that I have and to not do anything about it would be a waste, and that the capacity for me to be violent and for me to have this can only be used in a good way if it's used to help others and to help protect others. And that's the place for violence in Judaism, is when you're able to use it to defend and protect and keep people from getting hurt. And more so, this effect that I'm hoping it has is that it changes the perception of who Jews are and what they're capable of and how strong they are. And not just by non-Jews, but even more so by Jews. I want Jews to feel that they are strong, that they are powerful, and to have Jewish pride.
What advice would you give to somebody who is exploring their Judaism and a more observant lifestyle, but who just can't seem to crack the, making it their own and the commitment?
Take it easy. Don't feel guilty to the point that it harms yourself. And don't be so firm. If you give yourself chunk-sized bites, things that you can digest, you'll be able to eat more eventually. A power lifter doesn't go up and squat 500 plus pounds his first time in the bar, on the squat bar. He starts with 10 pounds, then next week does 20 pounds, next week does 30 pounds, slowly adding a little bit. Wanting everything all at once, like everything everywhere all at once, it's very, very difficult and hard for a human, physical, limited human being to be able to handle. And so understanding your limits and being kind to yourself is really the main thing.